I'm Kathleen Hartnett-White. I'm Senior Fellow and Director of the Foundation's Armstrong Center for Energy and the Environment. It's going to be very tempting for me not to speak on this topic, and that's not my job. I'm a moderator, not a speaker, because it means so much to me. And I'm in a few seconds, I'd just like to share with you why. This is a little different kind of panel than we have at the Foundation, in that it is at least catalyzed by not specific environmental issues or specific environmental policies of the day, but foundational policy principles on the environment. A number of us that have been at this for 20, 30 years have been struck for some time how our just fundamental principles are so different than those of the very, very powerful, I call, environmental establishment. And also the assumptions embedded in 40-year-old federal environmental laws. And we think ours are better. We think we're the environmental good guys. We think that our fundamental conservative principles are the ways you can craft policies that effectively protect the environment and allow prosperity to grow and for property rights to be secure. The panelists we have today on this issue, it's too bad this isn't a two-day conference. The depth and breadth of experience on environmental policy, on regulation, decision-making is vast here. I'm going to introduce them all right now, and then we'll get to the matter. And I'm not going to be able to do their, because of what I just said, their bios justice at all. There are not many people's bios I read in a setting like this, a panel at a conference, that make me weep. Just said this. Becky Norton Dunlop's truly does, and I shouldn't have said that because I've got a gulp. Becky worked very closely with Ronald Reagan for 8 years during his administration. Among a number of offices, she was director of his cabinet office in the White House. I just can't imagine what that experience must have been like. She was deputy head of presidential personnel. She was assistant secretary of interior for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and had a very key advisory role to Edward Meese in the Justice Department for cabinet-level policy issues. Then she was Secretary of the Environment in Virginia, a fascinating state. And then I believe 1998, you went to the Heritage Foundation, where she is now a Senior Vice President for Outreach, which is what we're all about, getting the policy and the message out. And I could say a whole lot more, but a jewel, and someone that has been a soldier in the fight we're all in every day for many, many years. Rob Gordon, next to her, is currently Senior Advisor for Strategic Outreach at Heritage Foundation. Rob and I go back a long, long way on these issues. And Rob, previous to his work for the Heritage Foundation, had a key, I would call the Endangered Species Specialist on the U.S. Congress House Natural Resources Committee, and very instrumental in articulating, although not yet passed, extremely brilliant reforms to that act. He also created a conservative environmental organization, again, very conservative, called the Wilderness Institute, and that's a story for another day, and a cherished friend. Chairman Brian Shaw has one of the most difficult jobs in the United States of America as chairman of the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality under the current EPA. Had a far easier job than he did when I was in that role. A PhD environmental agricultural scientist, still a professor at A&M, as well as chairman of TCEQ, a member of many EPA scientific advisory panels, as well as key environmental advice to the Natural Resource Conservation Commission. We are really lucky to have a principled man who's a scientist and a regulator and a champion of freedom and property rights like all of us. Last, but most definitely not the least, our Comptroller, Susan Combs. And I think many of us in the room know her, but when you look at her bio and realize how many different things she has done, how many contributions she has made, bold contributions that have really made this state better, it's really remarkable. And I go back to one on when I first met her, I was working in Washington, D.C. for the National Cattlemen, and Susan was a state legislature, and she got the Private Property Rights Act passed. It was a big deal. I think Texas was the first state maybe to get that done. And also influenced, because her work goes beyond, her influence and contribution beyond our state borders, because states are so interested in emulating what she has done. Her efforts on fiscal transparency and the use of the internet and communications for media of that are incredible, and are studied by states across the country. I could go on and on, but a very interesting role she also has is in an entity created by the Texas legislature in law. She is chairman of the, tell me if I have the name right, Susan, the Interagency Task Force on the Economic Growth and Endangered Species. And in her usual inimitable fashion, as she did with her transparency, has really given substance to this effort, used the internet to provide incredible information on endangered species issues in this state. So I must stop because this panel will not be long enough for you to speak, but one last thing, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation for bringing to life an effort. You have a fairly thick spiral book that a few of us, 3 of us are here, 20 years ago, got started and did it well, but like a lot of things, it got kind of on a shelf for 20 years. And the Heritage Foundation last year, with financial support and all kinds of other support, has really made something come to pass, which many people call a game-changing contribution to conservative policy. So with that, Becky, we welcome you.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you, Kathleen, and all of you, first of all, for the invitation to come to Texas. It's always a pleasure to come to Texas, and for being here today. I want to thank you. I know how valuable your time is, and believe you me, we think this is an important topic. I'm told that I have 10 minutes, but I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, so if I'm not finished, we're going to stop the clock, and then I'll just finish my remarks. No, I'll try to speak in 10 minutes. Well, we're here to talk about the conservative approach to environmental policy. And let me just start off by saying that this subject is a subject of great importance to many people, obviously to the people in this room today, but it is really important to people who are like us, who love liberty. We're not here to talk about grass and trees and critters so much as we're here to talk about liberty. That is the key element. And we want to see future generations enjoy the blessings of liberty as we have in the United States today. Now, the 8 principles of the American conservation ethic, which you've gotten a copy of today, really represents a new paradigm pertaining to natural resource, energy, and all manner of environmental concerns, from global warming, yes, global warming, not global crises, stop everything, but the global warming issue, to energy, to land conservation and other areas. The conservative approach is to evaluate these concerns through principles, a novel idea these days in Washington, D.C. The left has for far too long monopolized the debate over the environment and has successfully but wrongly painted conservatives as enemies to the environment. In fact, principled conservatives are better stewards of the environment, since we care about the well-being of people first, which is directly connected to the well-being of the environment. Now, I'm going to talk with you briefly this morning about the importance of holding to principles in establishing all public policy, and how that then relates to the specific principles of the American conservation ethic, which my colleague Rob Gordon will be discussing in detail. The American experiment is one which is founded on explicit principles: self-governance, ordered liberty, federalism, among others. Unfortunately, today, our government has become detached from these principles, leading to an ever-expanding administrative state. the power of the individual has been transformed to the power of the state. This is an inevitable outcome when too many people abandon the principles upon which our nation was founded. One area of national government where abandonment of principles has led to bureaucratic mismanagement, and that's saying it very kindly, is natural resources and environmental policy. Now, principles are essential because they provide a foundation and a starting point for evaluating policy options. When principles have been removed, all that remains is arbitrary policy decisions, power politics, and mismanagement. Government becomes entangled in competing self-interest and personal politics. No good or effective policy can come from such a mess of confusion. The EPA, for example, is not grounded in actual principle, but rather is guided by a bureaucracy and power brokers or rent seekers in Washington, D.C. The 8 principles of the American conservation ethic seeks to return environmental policy to that which is based on principle. At the heart of the conservation ethic is the principle of individualism. It is this core idea which gave philosophical and moral justification for the American founding, and which is enshrined in our Declaration of Independence and in the legal principles of the Constitution. Within these principles, there lies a very simple idea. People, individuals, are sovereign. People and individuals are given by their Creator rights and the freedom to care for their own lives, their own well-being, and for the voluntary and uncoerced participation in civil society. It is because of this that individuals are free to pursue their own happiness and enjoy the right to their own property. The current establishment environmental ethic, on the other hand, has a radically different view of the human person, which inevitably leads to a subjugation of the individual to an abstract notion of the collective, as if the individual is wholly separate and hostile to the society at large. Property rights violations, excessive regulations, massive taxation, and an ever-expanding bureaucracy are repercussions of this worldview. The framers of the Constitution understood the very basics about human nature, that people and the institutions closest to the people can better provide for their own needs than can a distant federal government. Federalism, as explained in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, provides balance and division of power in our society: the federal government, the states, and the people. Both the states and the people are reserved the most power, which many of our citizens today would probably not even believe. History shows us time and time again that except in rare circumstances like national defense, citizens, states, and civil society are more effective in procuring needs and fulfilling wants and desires. This principle holds true even in the case of resource policy, energy, and environmental management. It makes sense that the states maintain more authority than the federal government on environmental issues, because the states are the entities which understand their geography and circumstances much better than the federal bureaucracy. Environmental issues will be different in Texas than they will be in Pennsylvania. And Virginia is different than both of these states. The centralized command and control structure in place today is vastly inefficient, since it treats all states as the same, and we know that they are not. The Constitution further designates the people as an independent collective group responsible for the most basic and personal of needs. In Democracy in America by Alexis de Tocqueville, one aspect of American society which stood out to Tocqueville was the responsibility individuals assumed as a response to personal needs. The institutions of civil society were formed. Whereas governments are coercive actors and rely on exertion of authority, civil society is the realization of collective action through voluntary cooperation. These institutions have been much more effective in protecting the environment than the federal government. People best understand what constitutes their own well-being because they are the ones who are living, working, and making decisions to satisfy the needs and desires of their families and paying the cost to achieve those ends. An evaluation of the Constitution and other documents like the Declaration of Independence does give us clear guidelines into principles which are congruent with the American order. Private property is one of these principles. The founders knew that for any stable representative government regime, people must have the protection of their property against unjust intrusion. The left, the statists, and the radical environmental movement do not see private property as a fundamental right and principle. For them, property must be deconstructed for environmental preservation. Not only is this disastrous environmental policy, but it violates a core part of our American principles, that people can work, take care of themselves, and own the fruits of their labor. It is from America's governing principles that sound environmental principles are derived, and from those, environmental policy which will work for the people and for the environment. It is principles rooted in the power and value of the individual, the best caretaker of his or her own life. The response by the left is more government and less grounded principles. Unfortunately, our regulatory agencies are after political power, not a true care of individual well-being. But it is principles that give us the clearest way to devise effective policy outside the influences of Washington and Washington's bureaucrats and Washington's bureaucracies. Ladies and gentlemen, life is not perfect. In fact, it's not always pretty, and sometimes it can be downright ugly. But if we have clear principles, well established, based on truth, well explained, and well defended, each and every individual in America will have hope and the best opportunity to prosper in a growing economy and an improving environment. Thank you very much for being here and for your attention to these matters.
Rob, yes, please. By the way, that's a train. If anybody wonders what that sound is, it's not a liberal plot. Yeah.
Also being from Washington, I will deem Becky to have completed her speech ahead of time, so I have a few more minutes. It's so great to come to Texas. In fact, before people like Becky and I leave, they make sure we're leaving family behind so that we'll return. And it's especially true when you get to talk about issues like this and you don't have things thrown at you. Working in our realm, the environment, it's, we're deluged with bad news. Humans are degrading natural resources. We're disrupting the delicate web of life. Earth's natural resources are fragile, finite, and destined to degradation and decline. And supposedly, even renewable natural resources are threatened given the rate of depletion. The destruction is unsustainable. We're approaching some tipping points, runaway ecological catastrophe from extinction, or runaway global warming, irrevocable injury to other resources, water, air, and such. Human consumption is viewed as driving the destruction, and as population grows, so does the impact. and technological accumulation magnifies it, making kind of an ugly cycle. Profits drive that technological accumulation from a consumption-driven demand. And the threats humans present at the end of the day, even if some are speculative and the costs are enormous, demand action. And the preferred course is federal regulation and ownership, centralized and top-down. It's viewed as being necessary to protect Earth's resources. Making society environmentally sustainable will require some transformation. Achieving this will require jettisoning some obsolescent cultural concepts and institutions like private property and Judeo-Christian dominion and American notions of social and geographic mobility and consumption-oriented behavior. And while many may resist such an environmental transformation, we must establish policies that establish these new norms. Opposition will be significant, but eventually it'll wane, and ascending generations will have altered expectations tempered by greater environmental awareness. And right now you're all wondering, who invited this guy? Get some rope, right? It sounds kind of ominous. Well, I've asked other friendly audiences, what do these ideas have in common? And I get all kinds of responses from them. But the one I'm looking for is quite simple, and that is that they're all wrong. What we need, as Becky mentioned, are principles to guide our environmental thinking in a way that is consistent with the rest of our worldview, to our commitments to championing individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. With ideas that are consistent with your overall worldview, you can argue with more passion and confidence, and therefore, you're more persuasive. With such ideas, one has a firmer footing, and it's essential because none of us can master all the facts. You've got to have some safe ground to return to. And with principles, you can engage in debates on grounds of your own choosing. Now, the principles we think should provide such a foundation are not of my own making, as Kathleen alluded to. Kathleen and Becky and several other peoples had a big role in fashioning them. And these ideas have been tested and honed for years. They're kind of the antithesis of the worldview that I presented up front, really what I consider voodoo, the tired ideas of the environmental establishment. And most importantly, they are grounded in reality, and they're ready to ascend and transcend the obsolescent thinking of kind of Nixonian-era environmental laws like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA. Now, these principles, all 8 of them, are covered in more depth in this book, which I urge you all to read, but I'll touch upon them briefly now. The 2 most important being the first ones, and they're kind of the ones that all the rest hang upon, if you will. The first is by far the most important, and that is people are the most important, unique, and precious resource. This is both a value statement and a recognition of the power of human creativity. We believe that the inherent value of each individual is greater than the inherent value of any other resource. And accordingly, human well-being, which incorporates such measures as health and safety, is the foremost measure of the quality of environment. Simply put, an environmental policy cannot be a good environmental policy if it's bad for people. Moreover, kind of the second facet to this is that this principle recognizes that human intellect and accumulated knowledge are the only means by which the environment can be willfully improved or modified. The power of human creativity was most famously demonstrated by a wager between a resource economist by the name of Julian Simon and a perpetual doomsayer by the name of Paul Ehrlich. Many years ago, Simon bet Ehrlich, who had predicted that the world would have come to an end somewhere in the 80s, that any basket of natural resources that Ehrlich would like to pick would, in fact, over time go down in price, which would be totally contrary to Ehrlich's worldview. More people, you deplete the resource faster, supply shrinks, demand's grown, price goes up. Pretty simple test. Well, Ehrlich thought, well, this guy's an idiot, and he and his friend John Holdren, who became a science advisor to the current administration, picked a basket of 5 metals. What could be more finite, right, than metals? And a period of time passed, and they went and they looked at the prices, and lo and behold, who won? Well, Simon won. And in fact, not only did the basket of goods go down in price, but they went down even without accounting for inflation overall. It was amazing. Why? Well, because present trends didn't continue. And that's what Ehrlich and all the people in the camp who see human beings as a blight believe. We're just a mouth. What Simon understands is that we come with 2 hands and a brain. And we change the dynamics. I don't know all the particulars. Someone found a substitute for one of the metals. Someone else found a way to, identify deposits where we'd missed them before. Somebody else found a way to more efficiently mine them. And consequently, the human mind, creativity, the most important natural resource there is, changed the dynamics of the debate. And this is why Simon called human beings the ultimate resource. And once you understand this and put this as your first principle on environmental issues, you have your metric, it's got to be good for people. And secondly, you realize that people just aren't this blight on the surface of the earth, which is the viewpoint of the left. The second and secondly most important principle is that renewable natural resources are resilient and dynamic and respond positively to wise management. I'm talking about trees, plants, soil, air, water, fish, and wildlife. And once you recognize that, you realize that these things that we depend on for food, clothing, medicine, shelter, and innumerable other needs can be tapped and used. They're regenerated through growth, reproduction, and other natural occurring processes that cleanse, cycle, or otherwise create them anew. And these characteristics make it possible for us to use them now and ensure that they are available for future generations. It's not a license to destroy them, but it does mean we can tap them. Now, the other 6 I'm going to go through quickly. The third one is that private property protections and free markets provide the most promising new opportunities for environmental improvements. I think from probably an audience at TPPF, you guys get that inherently. The reality is that ownership inspires stewardship, and polluting another's property is to trespass or cause an injury. 4, efforts to reduce, control, and remediate pollution should achieve real environmental benefits. This happens often to be not the case with legislation in Washington. It ticks on things like the precautionary principle, which rather than cost-benefit analysis and risk assessment is a tool based on people's emotions. 5, as we accumulate scientific, technological, and artistic knowledge, we learn how to get more from less. This is basically the principle that says, human creativity is a good thing because it makes progress possible, and progress is real. It is not illusory. 6, management of natural resources should be conducted on a site and situation specific basis. I call this the don't mess with Texas rule. You guys know how to manage things in Texas better than somebody from Washington. In fact, you might not shut down building an underpass in San Antonio because you found one subterranean, translucent, dime-sized spider. 7, science should be employed as a tool to guide public policy, and that's, science should inform environmental decisions, but ultimately, such decisions should be based on ethics, belief, consensus, and other process. A law is determination to use force and force compliance with a code of conduct. We can't just leave that up to technocracy. And 8, and finally, the most successful environmental policies emanate from liberty. And, I'd love to focus more on that. Maybe we can in the question and answers, but it occurred to me recently as I was preparing for this, where how that principle first got added. And it was many years ago when Al Gore was down in South America at the Biodiversity Convention. You remember that. And about then he said, the central organizing principle of society should be the environment. And we thought, man, does he have it wrong. It really needs to be liberty. We choose liberty, and there is a demonstrable, a statistically demonstrable positive and direct correlation between the quality of our environment and freedom. So those are the principles, and the reality is all Americans aspire to improve upon our tradition of wisely using and conserving the world around us for generations to come. And we believe that the American conservation ethic embodied in these 8 principles is the best way to do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the chance to be here. As always, it's a good opportunity and an honor to be able to speak on these issues. And I think more importantly, it's a real important opportunity that we have to think about the consequence of the many issues before us and how we can go about solving those in a way that will actually lead to a greater likelihood of having beneficial outcome. I want to not miss the opportunity, though, before I start to talk about the time issue. We've had the D.C. side of things, but I have to warn you, I'm a professor at Texas A&M University. I'm used to speaking for 50 minutes at a time. So I don't think that trumps the D.C. thing, but I'll try to keep it short. I do want to talk about the underlying issue, and the principles that have been laid out beforehand clearly are a good guide, one that helps to make sure that you have a consistent and effective approach. And I think part of what we can contrast that and see how that is at odds with what we've seen somewhat long-term in the relationship between the federal government and state, but especially escalated during, say, the last 4 years. And that sort of question could be simplified to say, where should those decisions be made, at the federal level or at the state level? And clearly, there are significant differences between those two approaches. Just a couple of examples I will offer. One, the cross-state air pollution rule, a rule that was intended to ensure that states don't cause other states to fail to be able to meet their environmental standards that are developed and promulgated by the EPA. And in the process that we've devolved to from the federal standpoint, we were at a level where the federal government was making decisions about that rule and applying them in a way that completely missed the cooperative federalism that our founders envisioned and that, frankly, those who drafted the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act envisioned as the best approach to be able to solve those problems. Have the federal government address those issues that make sense at a federal level, but let states take advantage of the don't mess with Texas principle. I like that. Take advantage of that, of those site-specific information, the resources that are available, the geography, the climate, the industries, the people, just the technologies that you have available to be able to solve those problems most efficiently. That's not just a good idea, but that's also, I think, was envisioned and is very successful at being the classroom of the country where we can have these different states have opportunities to develop solutions that make sense, and those who do best are going to be those who are most successful. Those principles that work best can then be adopted and or improved upon by other states, and we continue to have this process much like the free market system where liberty drives our ability to do more with less, to be able to solve problems quicker, more efficiently, effectively. And the current approach where we have this federal, I view it as a power grab, and I think that's accurate. Not only is it does it fly in the face of the principles that we've been founded on and that these different legislations had in mind, but they're less effective. Another point in that is the flexible permits program that we had in the state of Texas, and frankly we still do have, but it was a program where the state of Texas grabbed that principle by the horns and ran with it. We basically developed a system where we could incentivize industry, those who held permits, to voluntarily reduce their emissions in a way that would provide them some advantage from a flexibility standpoint, but it provided us benefits environmentally because they reduced emissions and because they agreed to be subjected to even more rigorous modeling and analysis of their operating conditions, so that in the end we reduced emissions. We did so in a way that we knew would be more protective of the public, and we also were able to have the companies have greater flexibility, which helped them to be more economically competitive. So sort of looking at that, I think it's pretty clear, and most, I think, would agree that there is a profound difference in those philosophies, and that one could argue that maybe you need to make a change and move away from those founding principles if there's a track record that shows they're not being successful. I would argue the opposite is true. If you look at the state of Texas, we've had great improvements in our environment that I would hold up to and compare to any other state. We've done that while maintaining a relatively strong economic base. We've been able to continue to create jobs, create economic opportunities, and that's while carrying around a target, at least I perceive sometimes, that we seem to be especially targeted for additional scrutiny from the federal government. And so I think instead of something that's shown itself as a problem that needs to be fixed, the data demonstrates that we have demonstrated an opportunity for other states to emulate and for that freedom to be able to expand across the U.S. to be able to solve these problems more effectively. In order to, I think, restore those principles where we have a greater state-level control about the method and the means we use to meet those environmental standards, we have to sort of understand the processes we get to that sort of drive us away from that federal government role and the state role. And I think it's instructive for us to think about some of these issues that can have an impact at the state level as well. I've sort of sketched out 3 different, I guess, processes that are in place in all regulations that tend to lead to this system falling apart. The first is that when we have a problem, we tend to develop and adopt solutions that don't fit the size of the problem, and sometimes they don't even line up and cover the initial problem that we see to begin with. Give you an example. We had a great boom of shale gas production in the Barnett Shale in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and there were some measurements that indicated elevated levels of certain pollutants of concern. And so we were trying to make sure we had a good scientific and a sound environmental approach to assess the regulations in place and ensure that our regulations would protect the people involved in that. There was a lot of call to do away with drilling completely. There was calls for everything from if you're going to drill, you need to have very draconian regulations so that we protect people from this measurement or two of some elevated levels of gases that were taken. And instead of agreeing to that approach, what we did is looked at the data, and what we found was there really wasn't something wrong with the regulations. Instead, those elevated measurements were because of some maintenance issues, a failed valve, a seal that was no longer functional. Those are things that the solution of let's stop drilling or let's have much more restrictive regulations in place weren't appropriate and weren't even going to address the issue, because the issue wasn't the regulations. The issue was maintenance in a couple of sites had failed to meet the requirements necessary. And so oftentimes we, for political expedience or for others, we have a problem that shows up and it doesn't get missed as an opportunity to push someone's agenda and end up pushing for a solution that may be on the fringe of that problem, but in fact oftentimes fails to have any success at all in adopting that, and instead only drives the cost of goods and services and minimizes our ability for economic development and, frankly, for environmental protection. The next is what I think we often see is that the goal is the process, not the solution that we're trying to trying to attain. And I think that's largely where we are today, and that is the goal with what we see coming out of Washington often with regard to environmental protection is not to find ways to protect the environment and to improve the environment and public health, but is instead ways to protect the process, this process we have whereby we have all these environmental hoops that we have to jump through. And we sort of suggest that it's in order to protect humans and to protect the environment. But if you present facts that show that EPA's approach or federal government approach to minimize or do away with the flex permits, for example, or to disallow certain innovative and creative approaches that would have real and measurable environmental benefits, those get thrown out in order to protect the process. One has to ask, is the real goal environmental enhancement, or is the goal job protection, increasing one's power, increasing the process and making sure that it grows? And that's fundamental to most bureaucracies, that they tend to want to grow themselves, and I think it's something that is worthy to resist at all points and make sure that any increase in authority and power is measured in a way that we know it's going to lead to enhanced environmental benefits and minimize the undue costs associated with that. In order to effectively return back to those principles, I think we have to realize that just providing good data to show how we can meet better environmental goals by having the approach where the states have the ultimate decision-making authority is part of that process. But we have to keep in mind that there are those who intentionally or unintentionally have no interest in streamlining the process. They have more of an interest in protecting their jobs or growing their kingdom that they have. And again, this doesn't necessarily have to be a conscious decision. I know from my efforts working with USDA and EPA many years ago, back before greenhouse gases were regulated, they started creating these little subcultures, these groups whose task was to find ways to study and or develop responses to greenhouse gas emissions, and they sort of ignored the question that we needed to be asking first is the science really there to be able to effectively determine what, if any, action should be taken from the standpoint of man-made greenhouse gases, and instead we sort of move forward with a philosophy that we must go out and regulate it because I have a division whose job is to regulate this emission, and that leads to very poor policy, very poor regulations, and does not lead to us fulfilling our responsibility, and that is to ensure that we find methods to protect the environment, protect human health, and these principles that have been discussed today are key to making sure we do that in the most cost-effective and environmentally effective approach possible. So thank you for your time.
Well, I'm not a prof, so I'll follow the 3 B's of speech making: be there, be brief, and be gone. There you go. So let me just talk from a completely different level. I'm going to be wearing my CFO hat. Chief Financial Officer, State of Texas, worried about the economy, worried how to deal with incoming Scud missiles known as listings. I would agree, of course, that the free market is the best environmental steward. It's where you engage people's self-interest in a productive, rational way to achieve a positive outcome. And that's been really important. What's been missing in a lot of what's been going on is lousy data. We've been having lousy information driving regulations, et cetera, and the enormous increase in federal regulations. I watch as CFO, and I see these sort of looming things. So you've got in your seat a website sheet on keepingtexasfirst.org, and that is meant to drive you and the local communities to give you information as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act come to a neighborhood near you and decide to throw you a little hand grenade. I want to make a couple of points, though, which is that the most classic example, I think, of how bad science trumped reason and bumped off an economy was the northern spotted owl. The data was garbage. They shut down hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Pacific Northwest. And I remember reading that, oh gosh, the green guys said, let's just train them all to be wait staff because they can go ahead and get a new job and forget cutting timber. Well, of course, 20 years later, there's been an every single year 3% drop in the birds, and it's not because the guys in the plaid jackets are still there. It's because the barred owl hasn't left. Mm-hmm. And so you've got Fish and Wildlife got the wrong bird, got the wrong problem, and found a bad solution, and that is pretty typical. Second, mega petitions. We're in an uncharted area of the law. We've got these mega petitions, and I say this, I'm an old persecutrix, otherwise known as an assistant DA, and what I see in the legal perspective is that the burden of proof has shifted. So you have the ability, if I'm the Center for Biological Diversity or Wild Earth Guardians, I can file a mega petition. Launch this sucker in, poor old Fish and Wildlife is sitting there. There is no way on earth they can deal with this. Back to process, Brian. They've got these rigid clocks, they're sitting there, incoming missiles over the transom, and they therefore get forced into a settlement posture, which is really lousy. What we've had, there used to be about 20 species per year were proposed from 1994 to 06, 12 years. Since 2007, more than 1,250 species have been petitioned, as much as in the prior 30 years. The strategy seems to be keep the incoming missiles, blind them with the stuff, have lousy science, put fish on its hind feet, settle, and then move on to the next one, which means that the science is generally be coming from the petitioners and not from anybody else. And of course, when fish can't keep to its deadlines, you get hammered with 85 more lawsuits. And litigation, by the way, never ends. I love the darling little, what is it, Cactus ferruginous pygmy owl that was first proposed 20 years ago, 1982. It lives, it falls, it lives, it falls. Dollars are spent in lawyers, and back, by golly, again in the mega petition. And that poor little owl, real cute, he doesn't even know what he's doing. second point is that this statute is a killer. Unlike the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, at least the locals get to have some input. The ESA, you don't get any input at all. It's all command and control from the big guys. And of course, the so-called best science available, I know it when I see it. That's a lovely, lovely metric to be used. And in fact, if you make somebody keep firing this stuff off, the best available science is no science because you don't have time to get the science, which is why that makes it very, very difficult. Of the 1,401 species ever listed, guess how many have been recovered? 27. That's a whopping 2%. Now, if I look at that as the economist for the state, I think a 2% reduction in a bad over a period of time is not a good number. And I would not say that I have been very successful in recovering, which is why, to everybody's point, it ain't working. It is broke. Third, we do have a particular, really a history in the state of Texas about sort of market-based. And I hate to say this, but Kathleen and I were talking about the little aguja pondweed of blessed memory back in 1988 or 89. I wouldn't believe that I'd still be doing this stuff, but here I am, still 29 and still doing this stuff. So what you have is the mega petitions have caused all this, and so we've done these market-based things. When I was Ag Commissioner in 2005, we put together the Recovery Credit System, which has enabled those wonderful national defense heroes at Fort Hood to contract with landowner ranchers outside as the volume of interest grew, the price per acre to protect your habitat and give that credit to the feds dropped, so they get to blow up stuff, the ranchers get money, and it's a great market-based system, and it's pretty doggone nifty. All right, here's these mega petitions. We got 119 of these suckers. By the way, how do I know that? What's really hard? We have staff, the reason they sort of gave the task force to us is that we have enough staff to spend days and nights watching the Federal Register. We thought we had 118 species to deal with in Texas. Sorry. Last week, a wonderful professor from Illinois has decided that the, gotta get the name right, the plain spotted skunk, not striped, subspecies, the plain spotted skunk should be protected here in Texas, and I would like to know what on earth a guy from Illinois knows about anything in Texas. So this is the plain spotted skunk. There'd probably be the plain dappled skunk or whatever. But that's where this thing gets to be a problem. So here I am as a task force chairman. I'm saying, damn, I'm sorry. Delete that from the tape. Anyway, I'm saying this stuff is tough. This is incoming for y'all young people. You don't know what transoms are, but it's the top of an old door. The window comes in. All this stuff is coming in. How do you keep up? Well, it ain't easy. So the DSL, the Dune Sage Bush Lizard, was one of these little over-the-transom guys. It had been proposed for listing in 1982, only 30 years, like its friend the pygmy owl. All of a sudden we find out, wham, this sucker is up. We've been working on the task force. We're thinking about the Houston toad. We're thinking about the lesser prairie chicken. We're thinking about the black-capped vireo, the golden cheek warbler, all this other stuff, and then whammo, here comes the lizard. So oil and gas getting ready to be killed on this one. 14% of all of the oil in the United States comes from the delightful folks in the Permian Basin. We have an old bad word moment. And so they say, can you help work on this? And they put up $250,000 to go find some scientists. This is one of the key points I want to make. Good science will trump junk science. And I want to say thank you to A&M, and I want to say thank you to Texas Tech for working so hard. You had a 6 weeks window because the lizard goes dark. These little guys crawl around, they kind of quit lounging out in the sun, they lounge in the shade, and you got to go find most of them by about July the 1st. They did a heck of a job, and it was important to do that. Now, one key thing here is that in all of this stuff, I haven't mentioned another big flaw with the statute. It absolutely puts you on your heels in the sense that you can't sue until that thing is listed. You can't sue until it's listed. Well, what does that mean? They list the glass of water lizard. It's listed. Kathleen says, hell no. And all of a sudden, she's got a 3 to 5 year perpetual motion machine with lawyers to try to delist the glass of water. So you sat there. She no longer can drink that water. She's going to starve here because she is behind the 8 ball from the litigation. So what we're going to have to do going ahead is we're going to have to get all of us smarter at the local level. I'm a big fan of local communities. They know where stuff is, they know where everything is, they can get people in. Secondly, we're going to have to revise the statute. There is no doubt we have to reform it. You can't always be back on your heels on this. You've got to have some idea of the settlement process. We have to build scientific capacity at the state. We were lucky to find 21 people to do that in a short period of time, but the skunk, who the hell knows about the skunk? I mean, I don't. We shoot them in West Texas. I mean, not the spotted one. We shoot the other kind of skunk. And the point is that if you've got all these incomings and you don't know, how do you build technical capacity? How do you build technical capacity to keep up with this stuff? It is extraordinarily hard to keep ahead of potential listers. We have people all the time searching the internet. This Illinois one was not on the mega petition. It came out of another region. So we've got to build coalitions. You've got to be strategic. You're in it for the long haul. The owl and the lizard are 20 and 30-year deals. This is a very, very long haul. The point is, under the statute, there has basically been no recovery of the stated goal of protecting species. And the only time it works, the only examples that I can see is when we work and there's an economic reason. Think elephants in Africa, Zimbabwe versus Kenya. Think about these things when you give somebody a reason that is congruent with everybody. You will protect species, you'll protect the environment, and I would say you'll protect the economy, and I want everybody to shop, shop, shop here in Texas and have enough money to send me sales tax. Thank you.
Thank you, Comptroller Combs, and I think that was a brilliant, we have people before the Heritage publication made to the printing who are acting here, Chairman Shaw and Comptroller Combs, in just that way. Okay, we probably don't have a lot of time?
Like 7 minutes.
Okay, well, that's a lot of time, but please, Mr. Sparks.
How are you all doing today? I appreciate each one of you being here and giving us information. I have a question, though, and it may not be what you want to hear, but I've been involved in a group. We've fought this type of stuff now for so many years, and we're losing the battle. We are absolutely losing the battle. We don't have lesser of these things going on. So to get to my point, I was at a meeting in Vegas, and one of the guys there says Las Vegas is losing its drinking water. Lake Mead supplies it. We have new drinking water situations because the technology allows the EPA to go out and get a better feel on how much whatever mineral was there, and says it doesn't comply now. They have lowered it again. And so they're trying to figure out how to take care of it. Well, I get back to West Texas, and all of a sudden, I find out as we're having a drought, we don't have surface water. We're having to go back and utilize more groundwater. We're spending money to have more groundwater. And sure enough, our groundwater will not comply with the new EPA standards. My question is, we cannot continue to just file lawsuits. I want to know at what point in time do we, and we can't as an individual or an individual city, we've got to get the states and a group of states to stand up and say, we no longer will comply, and find out what the federal government is going to do. I do not believe if enough states do that they have enough troops to move in and make all of us comply. And I don't see how we correct this, so I'm putting that out. I want your opinion. That's probably not one you won't even answer in your positions.
I'll make a quick comment on the issue, because it not only does it apply to some of the water standards it implies of much of what we're seeing come out of EPA. And the point you make is likely with regard to arsenic. It's one of the contaminants in groundwater. I grew up in West Texas drinking water out of the Ogallala Aquifer, and today they'll tell you it has too much arsenic in it. And part of the challenge that we face, I talked about this earlier, is there seems to be a focus on the process, not on what really makes sense. And if you look at the studies, you look at the toxicology, you look at the data, air and water, EPA has consistently erred on the side, and often not even close, to really looking at factually what good science, for example, they often go against what study authors recommend in their statistical analysis. We see this with ozone, we see this with the risk levels that they try to push with regard to drinking water. And at some point, it becomes pretty clear that they're using their science, and I put that in quotes, to justify the regulations, because they've become very effective at, no matter what they want to push, they can torture the numbers enough to get the results where they can say they're saving so many lives, they're saving so many dollars in promulgating this regulation, when in actuality, if you look at the data, it becomes very questionable, and it becomes clear that the precautionary principle that they often try to apply doesn't work, because they're sort of assuming that always lowering the standard is going to have a benefit. But those economic costs, those other missed environmental opportunities based on what they're pushing, I believe are leading to failed opportunities to have real environmental improvement, to address real human health issues, and instead we perpetuate ourselves to where every 5 years we relook at a standard and EPA says, well, we didn't get the results we thought last time, it's time to lower the standard again. We'll pat ourselves on the back, but the population of the country and of the state are not benefiting because they're torturing the data to give them the results they want. And I could spend an hour talking about how they misuse the particulate matter emissions in their ongoing rulemaking to basically be able to justify most any rule that they want to promulgate, and the results are not real.
Well, I do think that is the challenge that we're all faced with. I mean, you had two people here who were talking about changing the way we think about this and talk about at the national level, and then two people who are on the front lines really for the people of Texas. It's an enormous challenge. I think Ronald Reagan's administration, while not perfect, was the last administration that had people in all the cabinet departments and agencies who actually were focused on returning power and authority to the states and thinking about liberty. Since then, it has just not been the same, and I'd be happy to talk about chapters and verses. I think the first thing the people in Texas need to do is to make certain that you have people like these two sitting at this table in all of the state-appointed offices. Anywhere you have a citizen holding office, they need to be people who identify with principles and guide from principles. And then you need to have heart-to-hearts with your congressmen and senators. Ultimately, the two senators from Texas and the congressman from Texas can't carry the day in Washington, but you have to start somewhere. We now have many more governors than we have had in the past. Too often, Republican governors have thought of the environmental post as the throwaway position. Well, I'm going to have a good conservative free market person as Secretary of Commerce, and I'm going to have a person who's for parental choice in the education department. But I need to throw something to the lefties, so I'll put them in the environmental job. I tell you, when I was Secretary of Natural Resources for Virginia, I had all of the responsibilities. I had DEQ, I had Fish and Wildlife. I would drive around the state and give speeches, and my husband would go with me. And I'd see a construction site, and I'd say, I could have stopped that. New school being built, I could have stopped that. New highway, I could have stopped that. There are so many rules and regulations and laws in the environmental area and natural resource area that they literally strangle the economy. You've got to get people who actually believe in the founding principles of our country and these environmental principles in these jobs, and then we have to start building coalitions. So your governor is a great governor, and when he goes to other governors' meetings, he needs to make sure he's talking to them about who's your environmental secretary? Do they believe in these principles? It's uncomfortable for a lot of Republicans to talk about this because they've been really focused on jobs and economic growth. They better get focused on this or they won't have jobs and economic growth in the future. So our point in being here today is you do a lot of things right in Texas. And now what we're saying is we've tried to take a lot of the principles that freedom lovers have thought about and put them into a way that we can talk about them to other people and apply them. And now we have to just start building the coalitions. We have to build up to be able to have people in Washington in the Senate like Jim Inhofe, your neighbor to the north, who stands up against Barbara Boxer every day in every way. And of course, he's crucified in the national media. So that's my only point to you is it's not too late, but we are reaching a tipping point in our country where the people who want the, what is it RJ says about green bricks?
Watermelon. Green on the outside, red on the inside.
Yeah, I mean, the people who want a collective government running our lives, they're going to be in charge of everything. And once they are, it won't be liberty. It will be the liberty we allow you to have. And so we're saying, let's start now. And know these people, know who these people are, support them when they're engaged in the battle. I mean, public officials will, you hear from the left, don't you? I mean, the left loves to come in and talk to their officials. They need to hear from the citizens who are affected by this and the people who believe in these principles and can articulate them. And then we need to expand the people around the country who are in office who say, we want to have a growing economy and an improving environment.
I just want to give, I know we're running overtime, but I want to give Comptroller Combs and Chairman Shaw an opportunity to.
Get ready, troops.
Yes, thank you. You know about the many lawsuits that we have as a state agency, and many question at what point do you quit fighting? And I think the issue there is based on principle. You don't stop fighting for those principles that are near and dear, because this is not just a matter of are we going to have a strong economy instead of a good environment. This is because of a recognition that in order for us to have a strong environment, we have to have a strong economy, because those go hand in hand. And the principles that we've talked about and we push for in this state are the ones that will help us to actually have effective and results-oriented environmental benefits, as opposed to those that we can pat ourselves on the back and say, we've done this again, we've hammered the bad guys, whoever they are. Even though your environment's not improving, we can feel better until 5 years from now when we're going to lower the standard again and we're going to try another approach. Instead, let's find solutions that make sense so we have a reasonable expectation that real environmental improvements are going to occur, and those folks that we're asking to make those costs and those investments have a reasonable expectation that what we ask them to do will actually lead to those benefits, and that we've tried to avoid the unintended consequences that may result in future costs for them. And so I think these principles help us not only to have a strong economy, but give us a better opportunity of having real environmental enhancement.
Well, we're unfortunately going to have to stop, and I want to, I'm just very proud to have brought to this panel these fine, fine leaders in this area.